powerful stories about family, love, loss, and the decisions that shape our lives. Now, let's begin today's story. The mornings in New England always begin quietly. Carol Anderson inevitably wakes at 5 o'clock in the morning. The habit from her 30 years as a nurse remains deeply ingrained to her body, even 2 years after retirement. In the dim light filtering through the window, she gazes at the photo frame on her bedside table. There, her late husband Tom, their only daughter Jessica, and grandson Ethan smile back at her. It has been 10 years since Tom died of a heart attack. She still remembers that day vividly. Her husband suddenly collapsed in the kitchen while she was making breakfast. She called an ambulance, but he passed away before reaching the hospital. Though Carol had witnessed many deaths as a nurse, losing someone she loved was entirely different. Jessica was the one who supported her through that grief. At the time, Jessica had just started her own graphic design business and was beginning to gain traction, yet she came to check on her mother almost daily. Jessica had been a gentle child from an early age. She loved drawing and was always sketching something. Using that talent, she chose her career path and had now become a well-regarded designer in the local community. 5 years ago, Jessica married Derek Miller, a real estate agent. Derek had failed in a previous marriage, but he seemed devoted to Jessica. On their wedding day, the way Derek looked at her was full of love, and Carol felt reassured as she sent her daughter off. Then, 2 years later, Ethan was born. Carol was over the moon at the arrival of her first grandchild. Ethan was an unusual child. From birth, she felt he possessed something special. When he stared with those large eyes, she sometimes felt as if he could see right through to the depths of her soul. When Ethan turned 3, he began saying strange things. One day, while visiting Carol's house, he was playing with blocks in the living room when he suddenly looked up and said, "Grandma, Grandpa is there." Carol turned around in surprise, but no one was there. Ethan was smiling while staring at a point in the air. "Grandpa is smiling. He says he loves you, Grandma." Those words gave Carol goosebumps. Ethan had been looking toward the chair where Tom used to sit. She told herself it was just a child's imagination, but Ethan's words were sometimes uncannily accurate. Everything changed 2 weeks ago. Jessica suddenly collapsed at home. When Carol rushed to the hospital after Derek's call, Jessica was already in intensive care. According to the doctor, it was heart failure. Carol could not believe that a healthy 35-year-old woman could suddenly suffer heart failure, even with her years of nursing experience. For several days, Carol stayed at the hospital. She held Jessica's hand, desperately calling out to her, but her daughter never opened her eyes again. In her final moments, Jessica's face looked peaceful, yet somehow sad. Derek seemed unable to speak from shock. Seeing him break down, crying in the hospital corridor, Carol comforted him. However, somewhere in her heart, she felt something was off. It seemed different from the grief she had experienced when she lost her husband, but she convinced herself that everyone grieves differently. The funeral preparations proceeded amid deep sorrow. Derek made arrangements between work, and Carol helped. Ethan had been withdrawn and barely spoke. Carol did not know how her grandson, with that mysterious ability, was processing his mother's death. The next morning, Carol woke earlier than usual. It was still dark outside, with streetlights streaming through the window. The day had come, the day to say goodbye to her daughter. While putting on her black dress, Carol looked at her reflection in the mirror. She felt as if she had aged 10 years overnight. After 7 o'clock, Carol headed to Derek's house to pick up Ethan. As she drove along, she remembered when Jessica was alive. How many times had she visited her daughter's house on this road? The thought that she would never again see Jessica greeting her at the door with a smile made tears threaten to overflow. When she arrived at Derek's house, the front door opened immediately. Derek was already dressed in a black suit, though his tie was slightly crooked. His hair was neat, but there were faint dark circles under his eyes. "Good morning, Carol. Ethan is ready. Please take care of him today." Derek's voice was calm, perhaps too calm. Carol nodded and entered the living room. Ethan was sitting on the sofa in a small black suit. The outfit, still too big for his small body, made him look even smaller. "Ethan, Grandma's here to get you." Ethan slowly looked up. His expression was far more somber than any 7-year-old should be. He stood up and walked silently toward Carol. "I'm going now, Dad." Ethan's voice was small and trembling. Derek patted his son's head, but the gesture seemed awkward. Once in the car, Ethan huddled small in the passenger seat. While fastening his seatbelt, Carol looked at her grandson's face. There was something he wanted to say shining in Ethan's eyes, but he wouldn't open his mouth. About 10 minutes after starting to drive, Ethan muttered softly, "Grandma, do you think Mommy was in pain?" Carol felt her chest tighten. Her grip on the steering wheel strengthened. "I think she wasn't in pain. She just fell asleep quickly," she started to say, then swallowed her words. She didn't really know what Jessica felt at the end, what she was thinking. She could never ask now. "Grandma?" Ethan's voice rang out again, louder. "This time, Mommy is here." Carol almost hit the brakes. When they stopped at a traffic light, she looked at Ethan's face. He was staring ahead with a serious expression. "Mommy is always nearby. Dad doesn't seem to see her, though." Carol took a deep breath. She knew about Ethan's mysterious ability, but hearing it in this situation was painful. Still, she thought she should listen to her grandson. "Is Mommy saying anything?" Ethan shook his head, but something still lingered in his expression that he wanted to say. The light turned green and Carol drove on. When they arrived at the funeral home, some attendees were already beginning to gather. Jessica's college friends, work associates, neighbors, everyone wore sorrowful expressions. Carol took Ethan's hand and headed to the waiting room. Derek was already at the funeral home, greeting attendees. Watching him, Carol again felt that something was off. He certainly looked sad, but something was different. She remembered herself when she lost her husband. Back then, even talking to people had been painful. But Derek was methodically handling the greetings. Everyone grieves differently, Carol told herself, but something still nagged at her heart. When she was alone with Ethan in the waiting room, Ethan suddenly tugged at Carol's sleeve. "Grandma, Mommy says there's something she absolutely has to tell you." Carol knelt down to meet Ethan's eyes. "What does she want to tell me?" Ethan said, trembling. "I don't really understand yet, but it seems like something important. Mommy looks really worried." Just then, a funeral home staff member entered. "It's almost time." Carol stood up and took Ethan's hand. His small hand was cold and trembling. They headed to the funeral venue. Many people had already gathered, with Derek seated in the front row. On the altar was a photo of Jessica smiling, only 35 years old. So much life should have been ahead of her. Fighting back tears, Carol took her seat with Ethan. The pastor began speaking about Jessica's character, what she left behind, and the sorrow of sudden parting. Soft sobs echoed among the attendees. Carol, too, wiped away her tears as she gazed at her daughter's photograph. At that moment, Ethan tightly gripped Carol's hand again. When she turned toward him, Ethan was staring fixedly at the altar, or, more precisely, at the empty space beside it. "Mommy," Ethan murmured so quietly that no one else could hear him. About 30 minutes into the funeral, the pastor's voice resonated throughout the venue, speaking of Jessica's kindness during her life, the happiness she brought to others, and the peace she had found in heaven. Everyone listened in silence, yet Ethan alone seemed restless, constantly shifting in his seat. Concerned, Carol gently glanced at him. His face looked pale, with beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His small hands rested tightly on his knees, trembling visibly. "Ethan, are you okay?" Carol whispered softly. Ethan shook his head, but his gaze remained locked on the empty space beside the altar, as though someone were standing there. "Do you need to use the bathroom?" Carol asked again. Ethan shook his head more forcefully. "No. Mommy is saying something." At those words, a chill ran down Carol's spine. Making sure no one else could hear, she lowered her voice even more and asked, "What is Mommy saying?" Ethan replied in a trembling voice, "I can't hear clearly, but it feels really important. Mommy is crying." Just then, the pastor invited everyone to observe a moment of silent prayer. As the room fell into complete silence, Ethan grew even more uneasy. With no other choice, Carol gently took his hand and quietly stood up. Derek glanced in their direction, but Carol gave a small nod before leading Ethan out into the hallway. Once outside, Ethan took a deep breath, his expression resembling someone who had just come up for air after being underwater. "Ethan, calm down. Take slow, deep breaths." Carol rubbed her grandson's back as she guided him into a nearby waiting room. Inside the quiet, empty space, Ethan finally spoke again. "Grandma, Mommy keeps repeating the same thing." "What is she saying?" Carol asked, kneeling down to meet his eyes. Tears filled Ethan's large eyes. "She keeps saying, 'Look at my stomach,' over and over again." Carol frowned in confusion. Look at her stomach? What could that possibly mean? Jessica had died of heart failure. Her stomach should have nothing to do with it. "Ethan, isn't Mommy saying anything else?" Ethan closed his eyes, as if concentrating deeply. After a moment, he opened them and said, "Baby, I think Mommy is saying baby." Carol's heart skipped a beat. Baby? Could it be? No, that's impossible. If Jessica had been pregnant, she would have told her mother, and Derek would have known as well. But Ethan's expression had never been more serious. He didn't look like a 7-year-old imagining things. Instead, he appeared desperate to deliver an important message. "Ethan, is Mommy really saying that?" Ethan nodded firmly, tears rolling down his cheeks. "Mommy looks so sad. She keeps saying, 'Save my baby.'" Carol slowly stood up, her instincts as a nurse kicking in immediately. If Jessica had truly been pregnant, and no one knew. "Ethan, stay here for a moment. Grandma needs to check something." Leaving the waiting room, Carol searched for a member of the funeral home staff. In the hallway, she approached a young man. "Excuse me, I need to confirm something." "Yes, how can I help you?" "My daughter, my deceased daughter. Would it be possible for me to see her one more time?" The staff member looked slightly hesitant, but upon seeing the seriousness in Carol's expression, he nodded. "I understand. Please come this way." Carol took Ethan with her and followed him. They were led to the preparation room behind the funeral hall. There, Jessica lay peacefully inside a beautifully arranged casket. Her face, carefully made up, still held the same beauty she had in life. Yet, within her expression, there seemed to linger an unexplainable sadness. Carol slowly stepped closer to the casket, her eyes fixed on Jessica's body. Her daughter's figure lay dressed in a black gown, and Carol's gaze settled on the stomach area. At first, she could not make out anything unusual, but upon closer inspection, the abdomen did seem slightly swollen. It was not a natural curve. The bulge stood out clearly from a normal body shape. "This is," Carol gasped. Her years of nursing experience pointed toward a possibility, yet confirmation would require a doctor's opinion. "Excuse me, could you call a doctor? There's something I urgently need confirmed." The staff member appeared startled, but noticing Carol's desperation, immediately placed a call. 10 minutes later, a doctor affiliated with the funeral home arrived. The elderly man, with white hair, listened carefully as Carol explained, then began a thorough examination of Jessica's body. After repeated palpation and visual checks, he finally pulled out a small ultrasound device. A heavy silence followed. Then the doctor looked up, his expression serious. "Ma'am, your daughter appears to have been pregnant." Carol felt her knees nearly buckle. Ethan tightened his grip on her hand. "Pregnant? How far along?" "Probably 3 to 4 months, quite advanced." Carol's mind went blank. Jessica had been pregnant, more than 3 months along. Why hadn't she told anyone? Why hadn't Derek known? Or had Derek truly not known? The doctor continued, "This is not normal. It's rare for a pregnant woman to suddenly suffer heart failure. We may need to re-examine the cause of death." With trembling hands, Carol pulled out her phone. She needed to contact the police. Something was wrong. There was still a hidden truth behind Jessica's death. Ethan quietly stared at his mother's casket and softly murmured, "Mommy, you finally got to tell them." The police arrived at the funeral home 20 minutes after Carol made the call. 2 detectives entered, an older male detective and a young female detective. The senior detective, Robert Williams, after hearing the situation from Carol, immediately began talking with the doctor. It's certainly unnatural that she was 3 to 4 months pregnant, and no one knew. Carol nodded at Detective Williams' words. The funeral was temporarily suspended, and the attendees left with confused expressions. Derek would also be questioned by the police. Pregnant? I had no idea. Jessica never said anything. Derek's face turned pale, clearly shaken. However, Detective Williams stared at Derek with sharp eyes. You really didn't know? Is it possible for a husband not to notice his wife is more than 3 months pregnant? Derek looked away and wiped sweat from his forehead. Recently, work has been busy. We didn't have much time to talk. The young female detective, Sarah Johnson, spoke up. Mr. Miller, we'll need to check your wife's cell phone and computer. There might be some clues. Derek hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. The police confiscated Jessica's belongings and began a detailed investigation. That night, Carol was called to the police station. Detective Williams was waiting with a grave expression. Ms. Montgomery, we found something important on your daughter's cell phone. The detective showed her a tablet. There was an unsent message Jessica had written to her best friend, Rachel. Rachel, I need to talk to you about something. I'm pregnant, but I can't tell Derek. He doesn't want children, and lately, his violence has been getting worse. Carol gasped. Violence? Could Derek have? That's not all. Detective Williams scrolled the screen. A message from another date appeared. Derek hit me again last night. I did everything I could to protect my stomach. I have to protect this baby, but I don't know what to do. I don't want to worry my mother. Tears overflowed from Carol's eyes. Why hadn't Jessica consulted her? Why had she suffered alone? There's more evidence. Detective Johnson showed her photos. They appeared to be selfies Jessica had taken. Blue bruises were visible on her arms and shoulders. Looking at the dates, they were from a week before she died. We also spoke with your daughter's friend, Rachel Harris. Rachel was someone Carol knew well. Jessica's friend since college, she had even been maid of honor at the wedding. According to Ms. Harris's testimony, Jessica had hidden bruises several times. When asked why, she said she'd just fallen, but Ms. Harris was suspicious. Carol held her head in her hands. Everything had been happening right in front of her, yet she'd noticed nothing. She felt like a failure as a mother. The next day, the police also spoke with Ethan. Under the supervision of a child psychology specialist, questions were asked gently. Ethan, have you ever seen your dad and mom fighting? Ethan was silent at first, but eventually nodded slightly. Dad hit mommy. Since when? I don't know, but I saw it many times. Mommy was always crying. Ethan's testimony matched the other evidence. Furthermore, neighbors testified that they'd heard yelling and noises from the Miller house late at night. 3 days later, Derek was called to the police station again. Confronted with the evidence so far, he finally gave in. Yes, I did hit her, but I never meant to kill her. Derek's voice was shaking. Detective Williams asked in a firm tone whether Derek truly had no knowledge of the pregnancy. After a prolonged silence, Derek finally lowered his head and admitted that he had been aware for about 2 months, explaining that Jessica had told him directly. He went on to confess that he did not want the child because his job situation was unstable and they were struggling financially. Because of those pressures, he had urged Jessica to terminate the pregnancy. Hearing this, Carol's hands tightened into fists as a surge of anger and grief rose within her. Derek continued, acknowledging that Jessica had refused his demand, which caused him to lose control. He admitted that his temper had escalated into violence, and Derek, tearfully, conceded that he initially only pushed her lightly, but over time his behavior worsened. Under mounting stress from both work and finances, he began taking out his frustrations on Jessica, striking her whenever his emotions overwhelmed him. A doctor was later brought in to provide professional insight, explaining that repeated violence and sustained stress during pregnancy can place severe strain on the heart and may lead to heart failure, particularly when both physical abuse and psychological pressure occur together, significantly burdening the mother's body. Following this, Derek was formally taken into custody and charged with domestic violence and involuntary manslaughter. As officers handcuffed him, he quietly whispered an apology to Jessica. Though his words carried no weight and reached no one, it was already too late for that. After leaving the police station, Carol embraced Ethan tightly, reflecting on how the truth might have remained hidden forever if the young boy had not revealed his mother's final message. With deep emotion, she thanked him sincerely for bringing Jessica's truth to light. Overcome with emotion, Ethan buried his face against his grandmother and cried, asking whether his mother was no longer suffering. Carol comforted him gently, assuring him that Jessica was at peace and resting happily in heaven alongside her unborn child. In the trial that followed, Derek received a 10-year prison sentence. Although he broke down in tears inside the courtroom, sympathy for him had completely vanished. A year later, during the autumn season, Carol and Ethan visited the cemetery together. Fresh flowers rested at Jessica's gravestone while soft sunlight bathed them both. Ethan, now 8 years old, had grown taller and appeared more mature. Following the conclusion of the trial and Derek's imprisonment, Ethan had moved in with Carol. In the initial months, he frequently woke from nightmares during the night, but through Carol's unwavering love and professional counseling, he gradually began to heal from his emotional trauma. One day, Ethan excitedly told his grandmother that he had created a drawing at school, retrieving it from his backpack. The illustration depicted 3 figures standing beneath a clear blue sky: Carol, Ethan, and Jessica, each smiling together. He explained that he had included his mother as well, because he believed she would always remain with them. Carol responded with a gentle smile, touched by his words. Ethan's unusual sensitivity remained, but over time, he no longer seemed afraid of his late mother's presence. Instead, he experienced it as something warm and comforting. Admiring the drawing, Carol expressed that it was truly beautiful and added that Jessica would surely be happy as well. Turning toward the gravestone, Ethan softly spoke to his mother, asking how she was and whether she was enjoying her time with the baby. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves in the surrounding trees, producing a soft rustling sound. Ethan listened carefully and nodded with quiet satisfaction, explaining that, in his heart, he felt his mother was expressing gratitude, thanking both him and his grandmother. Tears welled in Carol's eyes as she reflected on the past year, during which she had often thought of Jessica and regretted not noticing the situation sooner. However, because of Ethan, the truth had ultimately been revealed, ensuring that justice was served for Jessica and her unborn child. She had also learned that Derek was living in isolation within prison, with no visitors from family or friends, as both his parents and companions had distanced themselves from him. Although he had brought this outcome upon himself, Carol could not help but feel a sense of unease at how drastically a person's life could unravel. Gently, Carol took Ethan's hand and expressed her wish that they continue living together moving forward. Ethan responded with a smile, reassuring her that he did not feel lonely as long as he was with her. Together, they held hands and slowly walked away from the cemetery. On their way home, Ethan called out to her and shared one more message he believed he had received from his mother, that she had asked him to convey her love not only for him but also for Carol. Overcome with emotion, Carol stopped, embraced him tightly, and reassured him that he was her treasure, promising to love him with all the affection she would have given on behalf of both his mother and father. As the sun began to set, their shadows stretched long across the ground. Though their family had been shaped through painful circumstances, it was now bound together by genuine warmth and love. The truth Jessica had desperately tried to preserve through her life had finally been uncovered through Ethan's extraordinary ability, and in doing so, it had paved the way for healing, closure, and a renewed sense of hope for the future.